So today we are going to talk about cohort study, the chapter 4, and this is today's contents, including a brief introduction about the cohort study, the study design, how we do the analysis for the cohort study, and different type of bias in cohort study, and also the advantage and disadvantage of cohort study. And overall object of this chapter is to get to know what a cohort study means and the key features of this study design. And we also need to comprehend the design and analysis of the cohort study to get familiar with the advantage and the disadvantage of the cohort study. First part, the introduction of cohort study. So what is a cohort? So the word cohort came from the Latin cohorts. A cohort was originally defined as one of the 10 divisions of legions in the Roman army, consisting of 300 to 600 men. The most common application of a cohort study is to describe a demographic group of people, especially those having common characteristics. For example, the birth cohort. So the birth cohort is defined as a group of newly born infants. They were in during the same period of time, and therefore they might share a common life event. Other cohort like cohort of guests or occupational cohorts of chemical plant workers. So currently, the meaning of cohort has been used a lot in epidemiological study, and in epidemiological study, a cohort is used to describe a designated group of persons who are followed or traced over a period of time. And the cohort study, also named as the concurrent study, follow-up study, instance study, longitudinal study, panel study, or prospective study, is an analyzed epidemiological study in which the subjects of a defined population can be identified, and they will be followed up for a certain time to get to know their differences in the disease outcome. And the most important features of cohort study is to observe a large number of subjects over a long time period, and with the comparison of incidence rates in groups that differ in exposure measures. So when we say differ in exposure means the group of these cohort people will be classified into exposure group and the unexposure group. And let's briefly look at the study design of this cohort study. So the cohort study was first classified into two groups, and a beginning and a start points of the study. So the population was classified into either exposed to some certain risk factors or any factors that we are interested in to study, or the unexposed group. So we throw up these two groups for a certain time, and we look at the disease prevalence rate or incidence rate between these two groups. So if we detect differences in disease incidence in these two groups, we can have a conclusion that the exposure factors can be a potential risk factors for the disease. So this is the basic study design for this cohort study. So this is just figures to describe the study design of cohort study. And there are generally three types of cohort study, so including prospective study and retrospective study, and also another one is a combine of both prospective and the retrospective study we call bidirectional cohort study. So in this prospective study, we start with the non-exposure status, which means we know their exposure status at the beginning, but we don't know their disease outcome. So we follow up them for a certain time and to compare the disease prevalence between these two groups. So when we say retrospective, which means when we start the study, we already know both their exposure status and outcome status. At the third time, and bidirectional cohort study, which is, as I say, to combine both future or perspectives follow-up, or we're also using those already existing data to do a retrospective study. So the prospective cohort study is also called concurrent cohort study, where the subjects will be followed up from the time and the outcomes of interest will be recorded. So as I said before, when the study starts, the exposure status are already known, but the outcome are still unknown, and we need to follow up then for a certain period of time, for example, 5 years, 10 years, to get to know their disease outcome. So there are some famous or well-known cohort study, for example, the Framingham Heart Study, the Nurses' Health Study, and the Black Women's Health Study. They are very good examples of large and prospective cohort study. So the second type is called retrospective cohort study. So it's also called a historical cohort study. So one main feature is that in this retrospective cohort study, both the exposure and outcome have already occurred at the outset of the study. Retrospective study cohort study are also called longitudinal because they examine health outcomes over a span of time. So this type of cohort study is particularly useful for those unusual exposures or some exposures very unique. For example, they need to be a certain occupation type in order to get exposures to some potential risk factors. And the third type is called bidirectional cohort study. So this cohort study may also meaning that there are coexistence of retrospective and prospective phase in the study. But this type of study are much less common than those previously mentioned prospective study or retrospective study, but they are conceptually consistent with and share elements of the advantage and disadvantage of both type of studies.